Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In this video, we are going to be talking about chapter 11 of the book, which is Decline. And this chapter is about decline of Ottoman Empire, Mughal Empire, and other Muslim empires or regions in the world. And this chapter is also about colonization of different regions of the world, especially the Muslim world. First off, problems with Ottoman Empire. Islamic history seems to go in cycles. The rise of the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires in the 15th and 16th centuries signaled the rise once again of Muslim power on the world stage. The Ottomans, by the 1520s, had managed to even touch the edge of Central Europe at Vienna, and although they failed to take that city, they were Europe's premier empire. The Ottoman Empire's rapid rise was followed by a long, slow stagnation and decline. The beginning of this stagnation can be said to have started at the end of Sultan Suleiman's reign in 1566, although the Ottomans were still the most powerful European empire at the time of his death and would continue to be so for at least a few decades. Several factors played into the oncoming decline of the Ottoman state. Coinciding with the decline of the Ottoman Empire was the rise of Western European states, particularly France and England, which soon filled the power vacuum left by the Ottomans as they retreated from the world stage. The first and most obvious reason for the Ottoman decline was that it was no longer able to win decisively on the battlefield. Early in its history, the Ottoman Empire had a clear technological advantage over its enemies. It did not take long for the rest of Europe to adopt the similar technology, taking away the advantage the Ottomans had on the battlefield. In conjunction with this, the zealous warrior attitude that Osman built his small-scale Beylik on faded away as the empire got bigger and more stable. The Janissary Corps succumbed to corruption and bureaucracy and ceased to be an effective fighting force by the 1600s. More important, however, was that it had reached its natural maximum size. The tradition of yearly campaigns that set out from Istanbul every spring meant that Ottoman armies were most effective in areas they could reach before the onset of coming fall, especially in more northern areas of the empire that got colder faster. A prime example of this was the 1529 siege of Vienna. Ottoman armies left Istanbul in Mian, trekked across the Balkans throughout the summer, reaching Vienna's walls in late September, which gave Suleiman only a few weeks to conduct his siege before returning to Istanbul. This logistical problem meant that Ottoman armies could not advance any further than Hungary, leaving the German-speaking lands of Central Europe out of Ottoman hands permanently. Another attempt at Vienna in 1683 similarly ended in failure. The limits of Ottoman military ability became clear with the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699. After a devastating 14-year war that pitted the Ottoman Empire against much of the Europe, the Ottomans were forced to concede territory through a treaty for the first time in their history. Hungary, where Suleiman had marched victorious Ottoman armies in the 1500s, was ceded to Austrians along with Transylvania. Parts of Ukraine inhabited by Crimean Tatars, Muslim vassals of the Ottomans, were taken by Poland. Even the city-state of Venice made gains, acquiring Ottoman lands in southern Greece and along the Adriatic coast in the Balkans. And this is the map of dissolution of the Ottoman Empire from 1807 to 1924. The inability of the Ottomans to succeed militarily had huge ramifications for other aspects of the empire. At its core, the Ottoman Empire was a military state. Conquest brought in more wealth, people, and territory that would strengthen the empire and help it launch further military campaigns. With the end of the conquest, the Ottoman government would have to find new foundations on which to build the Ottoman economy. Such a fundamental change in the nature of an empire would always be difficult to manage, but compounding the problem was the decline in the quality of leadership that the empire experienced. From the time of Osman in the early 1300s to the golden age of the empire under Suleiman in the mid 1500s, the Ottoman Sultan was the ultimate executive of the Ottoman government. After Suleiman, however, there was a definite change in the nature of Sultanate itself and the role the Sultan played in the government. Starting with Selim II, Suleiman's son, many sultans preferred to spend time enjoying the luxuries of the palace instead of engaging in the governance of the empire itself. Beginning in the late 1500s, Sultan would appoint deputies to lead the troops while they enjoyed the comforts of Istanbul. Ahmad I's reform. Sultan Ahmad I cemented the lethargy of Sultanate. He officially ended the 300-year-old Ottoman tradition of princes fighting for the throne. Now all members of the Ottoman family were allowed to survive, but were forced to live in seclusion in palace harem. When a sultan died, government officials would go into the harem complex and simply pick the oldest surviving member of the Ottoman family to sit on the throne. Many of these sultans only came out of seclusion well into their adult lives and without any prior training in governance. Sultans were incapable of effectively leading such a large and complex empire. Administration thus fell to the viziers and other government workers who held effective power, albeit in the name of sultan. Ahmad I's intention may have been to protect the dynasty from costly civil wars, but the results of his reform effectively prevented the Ottoman dynasty from producing any capable or effective sultans during the 1600s and 1700s. Inflation. Further exasperating the military and political problems of the Ottoman Empire during its decline was the economic situation of the Europe starting in the 1500s. Western European nations such as Spain, Portugal, France, and England took the lead in exploring the New World and exploiting its resources in a mercantile system that emphasized the amassing of huge amounts of gold and silver. The mines of Central and South America, in particular, provided shiploads of silver that made its way into European markets through Spain. When this huge influx of silver hit the Ottoman economy, the Ottoman currency was greatly devalued and inflation increased. The Ottoman economy was thus hit on two fronts. There were no further wars of conquest that brought in booty, and the rise of the Western Europe weakened the Ottoman Empire by comparison. The huge influx of American silver caused runaway inflation in the Ottoman Empire. In 1580, one gold coin could be bought for 60 silver ones. 10 years later, in 1590, it would take 120 silver coins to buy one gold. In 1640, it took 250 silver coins. Intellectually, the empire stagnated in the 1600s and 1700s after centuries of Muslim advances in science. While Europe struggled through the Dark Ages, Ottoman scholars exhibited a certain amount of disdain for European intellectual progress. The reality was that in the 1600s, the Dark Ages were over. The Renaissance and subsequent Enlightenment ushered in a new era of European intellectualism, which was ironically spurred by the translation of centuries old Muslim works in major European cities. Most Ottoman scholars failed to recognize this shift, and European advances were disregarded as heathen innovations. Earlier in its history, the Ottoman Empire had sought to bridge the intellectual gap between Christian Europe and Muslim world. But by the time Europe began to take a dominant role in world politics, the Ottoman Empire's mistrust of its Christian neighbors led to an anti-intellectualism that prevented its continued growth. Despite all these factors working against the Ottoman Empire, it remained one of the premier empires in Europe and the Middle East in the 1600s and 1700s. The incredible growth of empire in the first 300s was so great that the military, economic, political, and intellectual challenges it faced in its stagnation could not completely undo what had brought the Ottomans to such dizzying heights. The fundamental nature of the empire had to change and adapt to new geopolitical realities. Most important was the relationship between the Ottoman state and the rest of Europe. The antagonistic relationship between the Ottomans and the rest of the Europe thus began to fade as Ottoman viziers recognized the era of expansion was over by 1600s. Nowhere was this clearer than during the Tulip period that lasted from 1718 to 1730 CE. During this time, the Grand Vizier of Ottoman Empire, Ibrahim Pasha, charted a new course with Europe that was characterized by trade relations and cultural borrowing. Tulip, popular in early 18th century in Western Europe, featured strongly in art of this period. In what were known as capitulations, the Ottoman government gave up effective control over huge swaths of its own economy and society to Western Europe as it declined. Sultans as early as Selim I had signed agreements with France, and these early capitulations were mutually beneficial, but as the Ottoman declined, the capitulation took on a new character. The Ottomans agreed to give up jurisdiction over French citizens within their own borders, which meant that they were effectively immune from any kind of prosecution or control by the Ottoman government. By the mid-1700s, the French managed to get all Catholics within Ottoman borders recognized as French subjects and thus under French law. Furthermore, they had the right to extend French law to any Ottoman subject they wanted. The result of this was the Christians in the empire were given a huge economic boost. They were given preferential treatment by the French, who covered them politically with the capitulations and then chose to trade exclusively with them. The majority of Ottoman overseas trade was now completely out of its control, and worse yet, the capitulations had to be renewed or even strengthened throughout the 1700s as the Ottomans continued to need French diplomatic support in order to avoid partition at the hands of Austria and Russia. The fact that the Ottoman Empire was willing to give up sovereignty within its own lands is indicative of how the empire had weakened by the 18th century. First letter from Suleiman to Francis I, Ahmed III receiving the embassy of Charles de Ferriot in 1699. Next is liberal reforms. Mahmud II. By 1800, it was clear that the Ottoman Empire had to reform in order to survive. Mahmud II reorganized Ottoman government to function in a more European style. Instead of competing viziers, ministries were established to oversee foreign affairs, domestic affairs, justice, education, and other government departments. The Janissary Corps was ended in a bloody battle on the streets of Istanbul as Mahmud established his Nizam-e-Sadid, the new system, which followed European military practices. Education was brought in line with European standards and French was taught alongside Turkish in schools. Even clothing was reformed. As Mahmud implemented his reforms, the expected opposition came from the religious scholars, but they were sidelined by the new, more powerful central government, which also began to exercise power in distant provinces. And this is Ottoman Sultan Mahmud II after his clothing reform, which made Ottoman dress more similar to Western European styles. Tanzimat. The reforms continued and accelerated under Mahmud's sons Abdul Majid I and Abdul Aziz. Abdul Majid's reign ushered in an era known as Tanzimat, Turkish for reorganization. Almost no aspect of Ottoman governance and social life was left untouched by the Tanzimat. The changes of the Tanzimat era included a modern postal system, a national bank, a census, tax reform, a proto-parliament, and an Ottoman national anthem. According to the ideals of the West, secular scientific education was promoted over the religion-based education that had been the norm throughout Islamic history. Earlier in Islamic history, scientific and religious research was seen as the same enterprise, and even the Prophet had promoted the advancement of knowledge. But with the imposition of French secular attitudes, scientific and religious knowledge was separated, with science considered more valuable. According to the reformers and their supporters, these were all organizational reforms that were necessary for the Ottoman Empire to function effectively in the 1800s. The Imperial Ottoman Bank, headquarters 1896. More significantly, the Tanzimat was a fundamental change in the way the Ottoman Empire functioned legally. The old legal law code established by Suleiman and his Grand Mufti in the 1500s was replaced with a new one based on the French system. No longer was the Islamic Sharia the basis for law in the Ottoman Empire. Since their earliest days, the Ottomans had prided themselves on being representatives and protectors of Islam. Now the empire was shedding away the Islamic tradition in favor of a liberal, secular, Western approach that it borrowed from Europe. Throughout Islamic history, empires had based their rule on the Islamic Sharia. Whether or not they actually followed it was a separate issue, but never before had a Muslim empire nominally recognized secularism as legitimate policy. According to the Sultan and his advisors, the reality of the times dictated it, and change was necessary in order to appease Christian Europe. Nationalism. Along with the rise of secular thought that came with the Enlightenment, nationalism became a powerful intellectual force in the 19th century. Europeans across the continent began to shun the idea of traditional pan-ethnic empires in favor of nation-states that were dominated by ethnic or linguistic groups. For the Ottoman Empire, with its Turks, Arabs, Kurds, Armenians, Jews, Serbs, Bosnians, Greeks, and multitude of other ethnicities, the concept of nationalism was problematic. When the Greeks managed to become independent of the Ottomans in 1830, the threat of nationalism became real. Other ethnic groups within the empire could similarly seek independence, leading to the complete dismantling of the empire itself. The idea behind the adoption of a national flag was inspired by Ottomanism. Failure of Ottomanism. Some officials, particularly ones educated in Western Europe and influenced by nationalism, attempted to bind all Ottoman citizens around the idea of Ottomanism. Under this idea, all Ottoman citizens, regardless of religious or ethnic affiliation, were considered equal. In reality, however, Ottomanism failed to unite the empire's people around one identity. Capitulation to European states still meant that Christians had a huge economic advantage that most Muslims did not have. Tensions between Muslims and Christians rose throughout the empire as Muslims realized they were falling behind as Christians were becoming more powerful and influential. In the end, this attempt at uniting all Ottomans as one people only served to increase tensions and agitation between religious and ethnic groups. Young Ottomans. The Tanzimat era lasted until 1876. The reforms of the period failed to slow the decline of the Ottoman state. Ottoman finances were still in disarray. Ottomanism and reorganization of the provinces failed to quell nationalistic feeling. Meanwhile, Western European powers continued to grow in power and influence as a new era of imperialism and colonialism commenced. Some Western educated government officials known as the Young Ottomans believed the Tanzimat failed because they were not liberal enough. They encouraged more European secularism and further limiting of the Sultan's powers. This powerful faction deposed Sultan Abdul Aziz in 1876 and replaced with his nephew Murad V. He was similarly removed and replaced by his brother Abdul Hamid II. This shuffling of the Sultanate by the Viziers was meant to bring forth leaders who would continue the liberal reforms of the Tanzimat era. Abdul Hamid II's reign, however, did not go according to the plan. Pan-Islamism. Abdul Hamid was probably one of the most well prepared sultans the Ottoman Empire had had in centuries. Abdul Hamid was able to travel Europe as part of diplomatic delegations and was reasonably well educated. In the mold of the classical era of Ottoman sultans, he was well rounded and was an accomplished poet, a wrestler, and even fashioned most of his own furniture. Furthermore, unlike his extravagant predecessors, he shunned the luxury of the new expensive palaces along the Bosphorus in favor of more humble accommodation at the smaller and more remote Yildiz Palace. Abdul Hamid II. Ottoman Empire during Abdul Hamid II reign. Abdul Hamid II's reforms. The disastrous Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 ended in the independence of Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro and the autonomy of Bulgaria within the Ottoman Empire. What was left of Ottoman control in the Balkans was slowly slipping away. Support from Britain in the 1870s held the Ottoman Empire together, which saw it as an effective buffer against Russian imperialism. Furthermore, the Ottomans had already declared bankruptcy in 1875. Although he had come to power promising to continue the liberal Tanzimat reforms of his predecessors, Abdulhamid took the empire in a new direction. The constitution written and implemented by his liberal Grand Vizier at the beginning of his reign in 1876 was suspended indefinitely in 1878, ostensibly because of the war with Russia. For the first time since the heyday of Ottoman power in the 1500s, the Sultan was truly in power. Russian crossing of the new painting. Caliphate's revival. Along with the power of the Sultan, Abdul Hamid brought back another forgotten aspect of the Ottoman dynasty, the Caliphate. It was significant because with the loss of so much Christian Balkan territory, the Ottoman Empire was now a Muslim majority state. The Turks, Arabs, Albanians, and other Muslim groups within the empire were joined by Muslim refugees who were expelled by Christian powers in Europe, including the Circassians, who were ethnically cleansed from southern Russia in the 1860s. Getting his subjects to unify around their Islamic identity and allegiance to the Caliphate was easier than the invented identity Ottomanism promoted. Furthermore, with so many Muslims living under European imperial domination in India, Africa, and Southeast Asia, he could use his position as the spiritual leader of the world's Muslims as leverage when dealing with European imperial powers. Pan-Islamism was heavily promoted during his reign as he hoped it would breathe new energy into an Ottoman empire on its last wind. Hoping to unite Muslims around the idea of Pan-Islamism, Abdul Hamid undertook a series of projects aimed at bringing back the orthodox Islamic nature of the Ottoman Empire. Railways were laid across the empire, but of special importance was the Hijaz Railway, which stretched from Istanbul to Medina. Delegations were sent to Muslim communities alongside Ottoman borders as far away as sub-Saharan Africa and China. In one particularly impressive act of Islamic bravado, he famously turned down Theodore Herzl and the Zionist movement, which offered to buy Palestine in exchange for paying down some of the empire's looming foreign debts. German military advisors were brought in to modernize and train the Ottoman army, while new naval ships were ordered from Britain, France, and the United States. Education was expanded throughout the empire as elementary and secondary schools were established to compete with the foreign schools funded by Christian missionary schools. By 1895, over a million students across the empire were enrolled in public schools, leading to a jump in the literacy rate. And this is Hijaz Railway 1914. Hijaz Railway Station. In 1908, Abdul Hamid II established an Islamic university in Beijing, China, to serve China's Hui Muslims. Despite his efforts at modernizing the empire while maintaining Islamic and monarchical nature, Abdul Hamid was unable to stop the spread of liberalism and secularism within his domain. The European educated elites never stopped hoping for a new Ottoman state based on the ideas of Western Europe, and in 1909, Abdul Hamid was deposed by a secret society known as the Young Turks. Supported by Ottoman Christians and inspired by European secular liberalism, the Young Turks managed to end Abdul Hamid's 33-year reign and its Islamic-oriented administration. They chose not to end the Sultanate, however. For the next 13 years, two more sultans would reign, but only as puppets with no authority. Real power for the rest of the Ottoman history was in the hands of Young Turks. India. Decline of Mughals. After the apogee of Mughal rule in India that occurred during the reign of Aurangzeb, the centralized nature of the empire began to unravel. Even in its heyday, the Mughal Empire was an amalgamation of various kings and governors owing allegiance to the Mughal emperor. This allegiance began to wane in the years after Aurangzeb's death. The main reason for this was the destabilizing wars of succession that racked the empire. His son Azam Shah ruled for only 3 months before being killed by his half-brother Bahadur Shah in 1707, who in turn only ruled for 5 years before his own death. In all, 5 emperors ruled in the 12 years after Aurangzeb. Local rulers still nominally accepted the authority of the Mughal state as their overlords, but in practical matters, the Mughals had little to do with what happened in the provinces. Even when Emperor Muhammad Shah managed to provide stability and rule the empire for almost 30 years, local rulers had little use for the Mughal government. The fragmentation of the Mughal empire had already begun. In the early 18th century, India owned 25% of world's wealth. As the empire as a whole began to unravel and break up into effectively independent states throughout the 1700s, instability reigned. Pashtuns, Bengalis, Sikhs, Hindu Marathas, and even the British were active in the struggle for power in post Aurangzeb India. The Pashtuns in the north, led by Ahmad Shah Durrani, managed to establish an independent kingdom that would later evolve into modern Afghanistan by taking land from the declining Safavid and Mughal empires. Sikhs, who strongly resented Mughal authority after the death of Akbar, managed to exercise more autonomy through militaristic domination of the Punjab region. The Marathas, a confederacy of Hindus in western Deccan, was one of the biggest threats to Mughal empire's continued existence. They managed to conquer most of northern and central India by the mid 1700s, only to be eventually marginalized by the Afghans and Safavids in the north and the independent state of Mysore in the south. And this is Indian subcontinent from 17th to 18th century. East India Company. As states rose and fell in their quest for power in the 18th century India, Britain entered the fray. The British East India Company, a trading entity that had been doing business in India since the early 1600s, used disunity throughout India to expand its own control in the subcontinent. Beginning in the 1740s, the British Company began to get involved in the wars in the Deccan. Within decades, the British managed to leverage their position in India to obtain trading rights throughout much of the country, as well as authority as tax collectors and government advisors along much of the Indian Ocean coast. The British even managed to install their own favored government in Bengal in 1757 by using party politics in the region to their own advantage. By the late 18th century, the British East India Company had risen from being one power among many in disjointed India to the leading political force with its own independent administration, military, economic, and political goals. Robert Clive meets Mir Jafar at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Several factors made the East India Company's period of rule one that was disastrous for India, particularly the subcontinent's Muslims. Firstly, the purpose of any company is not to rule according to law and order, but rather to make money for stockholders. Thus, company rule in India was horribly exploitative. British free trade rights devastated economic competition from local merchants, leading to monopolies over many goods and crafts wherein the British could exploit local populations for revenue. The company was especially disastrous for Muslims. The British, keen to make sure that the Mughals remained unable to rise again as a major power, tended to favor Hindu middlemen over Muslim ones. Furthermore, the Muslim-ruled areas in the north were fertile ground on which British power could grow, in contrast to Hindu south, where Mysore managed to hold off British advances in the 1700s. 1857 War. Officially, the East India Company did not have real sovereignty over most of India and only exercised control through the myriad local rulers. That changed when Indian soldiers serving in the company army, known as sepoys, mutinied in 1857. The spark that lit the Sepoy rebellion was their discovery that the gunpowder cartridges that they had to bite on to open were greased with pig and cow fat, which was objectionable to both Muslims and Hindu soldiers. The rebellion exhibited a deep-seated resentment of the British, who were plundering India as part of their global empire, but the rebellion ended in failure for the Indians. The British government chose to confiscate company lands and rule India as an imperial entity known as the British Raj. Although both Muslims and Hindus participated in the revolt, Muslims were given most of the blame and their social status in India continued to sink in as a result. Furthermore, the Mughal Empire was officially abolished as punishment for Emperor Bahadur Shah II's support for the rebellion. Two sepoy officers and a private sepoy in 1820s. The death of John Finnis on the parade ground at Meerut. Africa, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. North Africa. European imperialism managed to take a more direct role in the lands further away from the traditional centers of Muslim power in Istanbul and Delhi. Britain, France, Russia, and the Netherlands managed to conquer Muslim populations and add them to their expanding imperial domains. The Mediterranean coast of North Africa had been nominally Ottoman since the 16th century. Local governors owed their allegiance to the Ottoman Sultanate. In the subsequent centuries, a tradition of raids and counter-raids existed in the Mediterranean between the Muslims of North Africa and the growing naval powers of Europe. In any case, by the late 1700s, the tide had turned in Europe's favor and Europeans were finally able to reach the mainland of North Africa, bombarding its major cities such as Algiers and Tripoli. Even the newly established United States of America got in on the action, attacking Tripoli in 1805. It did not take long for North Africa to fall to its perennial enemies. The French attacked Algiers and its surrounding territory in 1830, carving out the colony of French Algeria. Hundreds of thousands of French people moved to Algeria, dominating its local economy and culture, while its native inhabitants were reduced to second-class citizens. Tunisia was similarly invaded and conquered in 1881. In 1911, the newly unified Kingdom of Italy declared war on the Ottoman Empire and managed to wrest the provinces of Tripolitania, Cyrenaica, and Fezzan, which it merged into one colony, Libya. Morocco, in the far west of North Africa, was carved into zones of influence and later protectorates by Spain and France. Muslim self-rule over the Maghreb was over in the 19th century as European nations scrambled to claim territory as their own. And this is the map of African colonies after the Berlin Conference of 1884. Egypt. Napoleon invaded the Ottoman-controlled land in 1798 in an effort to protect French and disrupt British trade in the region. The campaign ended in failure, and in the power vacuum that followed the invasion, an Ottoman military commander Mehmet Ali managed to seize power for himself in Egypt. He undertook reforms aimed at modernizing Egypt along European lines well before the Ottomans got into the Tanzimat era. This continued, and Europeans reciprocated by investing heavily in the region, culminating with the construction of Suez Canal in 1869, financed by the French. This led to popular demonstrations in favor of Egyptian nationalism and against the ruling dynasty in the 1880s. The British and French governments invaded Egypt in 1882, defeated the nationalists, and propping up the Mehmet Ali dynasty. From then on, Egypt was under military occupation by the British, although it officially remained an Ottoman territory until 1914. Napoleon in Egypt. West Africa. European colonialism was not limited to the north of Africa. Remote West African Muslim states and the trade-based states of the East African coast also fell to European encroachment. West Africa, already heavily depopulated because of the Atlantic slave trade, was by this time incapable of resisting invasions. The coastal areas where Islam had not penetrated very deeply were by the 19th century dependent on Europe traders in the major port cities. From these bases, the French quickly moved inland in the late 1800s. The Muslim state of Niger River Valley, long protected by the vast Sahara to the north and the dense forests to the south, were unprepared for the French onslaught. By 1895, the greater part of West Africa was brought under French control. The wealth and power of medieval Mali became no more than a memory as West Africa was incorporated into the colonized world dominated by competing European powers. And again, this is the map African colonies after the Berlin Conference of 1884. East Africa. In East Africa, the British took the imperial lead. The Swahili coast was vital to British plans to control Africa along a north-south axis from Egypt to South Africa. But since the early 1700s, Ottoman controlled a maritime empire that stretched along the East African coast. Its main base was the city of Zanzibar in what is now Tanzania. By this time, the Indian Ocean trade routes were not nearly as important as the Atlantic ones dominated by Europe. The Omanis were thus forced to deal with the British, who gained influence over the Omani government throughout the 1800s. When a succession crisis arose in 1856, the British forced the separation of Oman and Zanzibar into two states, thus weakening both. When the Zanzibari government could not control its territories effectively, the British took the opportunity to establish a protectorate over the entire region. And these are the trade routes. On 27 August 1896, Britain defeated Zanzibar in the shortest war in history, lasting only 40 minutes. The impetus for the war was the succession to the Zanzibari throne of a sultan who wanted to move Zanzibar out of Britain's sphere of influence. Central Asia. Russia had conquered the Tatar Muslims of Volga region as early as 1500s, along with their traditional capital at Kazan. The Tatars re-emerged as a powerful economic force by the 19th century. They served as middlemen in the trade between Christian Russia and the Turkish lands of Central Asia, an island of their own surrounded by the Persians and encroaching British in the south, China to the east, and Russia to the north. The Turks of Central Asia were in no position to hold off Russian influence. The Russians began to annex lands in Central Asia in the 1800s, aided greatly by new railroads that linked the region with the center of Russian power further west. The Russian advance alarmed the British, who ruled over India, prompting their incursion into Afghanistan, seeking to counter the Russians. The entire conflict and rivalry between the two powers dividing up Muslim Central Asia between them became known as the Great Game. By the end of the century, the Russians managed to conquer the entirety of the Turkish lands all the way up to the Persian-dominated Khorasan. The Great Game. Persia. While neither the Russians nor the British managed to conquer Persia outright, they both exerted considerable influence in the country. The Qajar dynasty, successors to the Safavids since the late 1700s, increasingly fell under the influence of the Russians who pressed upon its northern borders. Russia negotiated treaties with Persia that gave them special political and economic privileges, much like the capitulations of the Ottomans. The Russians held sway in Tehran, but the British, through their systems of protectorates over Arab sheikdoms along the Persian Gulf Coast, exercised a sphere of influence over the southern part of Persia. Political and economic independence in the Persian homeland was effectively over by the end of 19th century as Russia and Britain competed to take advantage of country and its resources. Malay Archipelago. In Malay Archipelago, the Dutch extended their trading empire in much the same way as the British did in India. The Dutch East India Company established bases throughout Southeast Asia from which they traded spices with the local Muslim kingdoms. The commercial colonizers did not hesitate to use military might to extend commercial opportunities. In 1641, the Dutch forced the Portuguese out of the important port of Malacca, which they had occupied since 1511. In 1621, the Dutch in the Banda Islands massacred over 10,000 people in an effort to solidify Dutch control over the nutmeg crop in the region. Local Muslim sultanates in Java and Sumatra did not go peacefully, and revolts against Dutch rule were a constant thorn in the side of colonial rule. The vast economic resources of the Dutch, combined with their superior technology and lack of help from the rest of the Muslim world, led to a Dutch empire in Southeast Asia that lasted until after the Second World War. And this is the map showing colonies in Southeast Asia, 1895. Overall, the 19th century saw the loss of Muslim political power across the Muslim world. Britain, France, Holland, Russia, and others all took advantage of Europe's growing power relative. Conquering the world and teaching native people how to live in a Western fashion was the white man's burden, as Rudyard Kipling so famously wrote. With this sense of cultural and civilizational superiority, European colonizers obviously did not care much for local traditions or customs. This was not due to the ignorance of Islamic history. In fact, the 19th century was when European fascination with the East reached a high tide. Books on Prophet, Islamic history, and Muslim beliefs were published in all the major cities of Europe. And this is the poem, The White Man's Burden. It was perhaps because of this recognition of Islamic history and the potential political and cultural power of Muslims that Europeans insisted on there being no native control over Muslim lands. In the 1800s, the concept of divide and conquer was used to fracture a Muslim world that had experienced immense power during times of unity under the Umayyads, Abbasids, and Ottomans. Arbitrary borders were in an effort to divide up Muslim political capital and make the conquered territories easier to subjugate and rule. Piece by piece, the Muslim world was taken by Europe, so that by the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, the vast majority of Muslims were under foreign occupation. And that is end of this chapter. And in the next one, we are going to be talking about the last chapter, which is about different ideas. Stay tuned for that. Inshallah, after that, we are going to be talking about a different book.